Here are almost all of the drawings I've done for YouTube in August. I thought it might be interesting to have a quick sketchbook, so to speak, flip through and to revisit some of the techniques and tips that we looked at that are demonstrated in these drawings. So let's start looking. We'll start with 3 drawings that illustrate manipulating certain elements of drawing to create a sense of depth. Here we have a beach scene. When we have a great depth of plane in our scene, when we have things very close and very far, I like to do the very close things in a darker, heavier pen. Well, not actually a darker pen, but it looks darker because the lines are thicker. And because these objects are closer, even in a very quick drawing such as this, I do draw them with more detail. I'm drawing individual leaves here. And when I do the hatching on this tree, I do the hatching indicating the ellipse shape of the tree to show the perspective that we're close to the tree, that we're looking down the tree and we're looking up the tree, and that's indicated by these hatching lines going from curving downwards to becoming straight to starting to have a hint of curving upwards. I switch to a lighter pen for these midfield subjects and I draw them with a lighter touch. And by the time I get to these figures, I'm switching again to a very light pen, a very thin pen. I draw them lightly and I just do a hint of their footprints going off into the distance. Sometimes though, we're drawing depth and we have a lot of objects in our scene, such as in this landscape. But the same principles can be used. A heavier pen in these foreground objects, drawn with more exactness in terms of silhouettes and individual objects such as leaves or tufts of grass or even seed heads. But as we move further away, we're becoming more gestural in our line work. We're not drawing individual leaves at all. We're drawing more the effect of the leaves, but we'll talk about that with some other pictures. And again, a lighter feel as we move back. And so in this drawing, I went from a 0.5mm pen to a 0.3mm pen to a 0.2mm pen and to a 0.1mm pen. But it's not just that we change our pen, we change the way we conceptualize the objects. And so this tree, or part of a tree, in much detail compared to this one is still more detailed than this one, When we come over here, there's really just a very gestural indication of trees. It's more just hatching to indicate value, darkness areas. When we come to these trees, we've lost individual trees. It's more like there's a tree texture over the landscape. And by the time we get to the far distance, the trees have really just become part of the mountainous terrain. And whether our hatching indicates trees or shadow on the mountains, we really don't know. And our third example for depth is this Italian village. And while we still do have a great depth of plane between, say, this stump in the foreground and this mountain in the background, far more of our scene is much closer to us. And here we then have to be careful the way we draw our line work, the thickness of our lines, our hatching, the detail that we choose to draw to help give a sense of the closer things being closer. So for instance, this fence here, and trying to preserve the white space of these beams, showing things carefully behind them, making sure we draw the closest objects first, even if we start at the back and come forward, still add in closest objects when we come to them so we know exactly where to put them, and often leaving a slight gap in our line work so that we just create a bit of visual breathing space around the subject so that it doesn't get tangled with what's behind. Next, we have a couple of drawings that focused on hatching. One of them was this Swiss castle. And here the challenge was to use the hatching to again help create distinction of different depths of plane, but also different forms. We have the walls down here of this building. We have the walls of the castle. We have the tiles of the roof or the shingles on the roof. And we have all of these trees here. And what we want to do is create a sense of different textures, but also we want to create separation between the trees. And so we hatch to create value as well as to indicate form. And we position our values so that we have lights and darks next to each other to make really clear separation between the trees. We also choose our hatching lines, the direction of our hatching, to give an indication of the form that is underneath, and to separate, to change the direction of things that are close to each other as well, to help make it obvious what the changes are. So in these towers, the hatching follows the perspective angle as it goes horizontally around the towers. But a very different subject is this Australian waratah. Now here the hatching's being used for two things. It's being used to represent shadow and shade. So we have hatching to indicate on these lower sepals, shadow being cast by the great massive stamens of what is in fact a large cluster of individual flowers altogether. But hatching is also used to represent the green colour of the leaves. And it's not particularly that the green is a deeper colour than the red, because these flowers are a very bright, deep red colour. But this is where we can choose to manipulate our image somewhat and choose to highlight the green in a way to separate it from the red, to separate these shapes of the leaves from these similar shapes that are part of the flower. And again, I've used my hatching direction to indicate the surface of the leaf and the fact that these leaves curve upwards around a central vein. And again, we actually draw the closest ones with a heavier, more intentional line that becomes lighter and more gestural as it goes further back, because there still is an effect of depth we're creating here. There's an effect of depth we're creating here on this flower head, with these stamens shown in somewhat more detail, albeit still very gestural, compared to the ones up the back, where we just start to have some lines suggesting the form that they have. I have a couple of drawings to indicate value, using value, which is simply lightness and darkness. But instead of using hatching to indicate value, we've primarily used inks of different darkness and lightness to create the effect of colour, shade and shadow. Darker values tend to come forward and look closer, and lighter values move further back often. And so we've kept our values very light in the distance here, where we can see the other line techniques used to help create the effect of distance. And we've got darker values closer. And one interesting thing about values is that values look light or dark very much often according to what values are next to them, are closer to them. So if we have a mid-tone and we put a darker value next to it, it will look quite different than if we put, say, a white next to it. And the eye is naturally taken to areas of strong contrast because we can see them easily. And so places such as here, where we have a very dark value coming up against the white of the paper, grab the eye. And the contrast also creates a lot of drama. And so it's great to make sure that we exploit or even exaggerate, or sometimes, if necessary, create these moments of dramatic value contrast. The other drawing I did, which is quite a recent one, that was to do with value, was this French church. And the challenge was that there was a lot of shadow and shade on this. In fact, the actual sunlight was quite minimal. And the temptation would be to go just too much in midtones, whereas the more effective technique is to establish all of the midtones, but to keep a few of them a bit lighter and to push some of them just a bit darker, so that we create a greater variation. And it also helps us read the various architectural elements more easily, because we have greater gaps visually now supplied by the value between those various architectural elements. The next area we have a number of examples about is line work. In this bench made from fallen timber in a national park, The challenge was to keep the line work of the bench strong enough and separate enough from the line work around to stand out and to not get lost. And part of the way I did that was to simplify the line work I actually did on the slabs of timber to create a whiter effect, but also the fact that these lines were kept approximately horizontal as much as possible also created a contrast, a sense of separation. And then also trying to allow a little bit of visual separation between the different subjects. And a darker, heavier outline here. In a very different sort of seat, our line work is used to different effect. We're wanting to capture the curves of the chair, the curves of the pattern, and also the curves of some of the textures of this cane chair with all of its cane wrappings. So we want to have the lines having a nice rhythmic curved feeling, contrasted with these lovely horizontal lines indicating the binding of more cane around some of the structural pieces. Drawing goes beyond an accurate representation of the form, of the dimensions, and into trying to create a feel and effect, which I also did with this drawing of one of Marie Antoinette's cottages in the grounds of the Palace of Versailles, where I deliberately kept a very loose, ragged feel to my line work, because this is a thatched roof. It's a cottage that's bagged with some sort of rough rendering. The timber beams are undressed. There's a hedge here, which obviously has a lot of surface texture. And I wanted to have that sense. I also wanted to capture in my line work the bright, strong sunlight and contrasting shadows. So I avoided any long, straight, continuous lines anywhere. I kept all my lines fairly short. Lots of broken lines, dotted lines, building up texture at parts, but also showing restraint, such as on this wall, to capture the sunlight effect. Sometimes the challenge is lines when there is just so much detail. And in this one, a video on drawing bare trees in streetscapes that have things behind, and just the challenge of not just basically drawing whatever's behind and then drawing the lines of the bare tree over the top, which really creates a tangle, and it doesn't create the effect of what we see, which is still the bare branches of the tree being visually prominent. And so we always need to draw the branches in first and to try and capture both the volume of branching, but also the pattern of that particular tree's branching. And we'll go down from trees to a clump of some sort of grass, reedy like plant, and looking at controlling our lines so that in a tangle such as this, we still define form and capture the feel, the 360-degree 3D form of these strappy thin leaves branching out towards us, on each side of us, and away from us. Our line work is so very important. I hope you caught some of those videos. A number of drawings had a focus on keeping proportion, not just keeping proportion, but using proportion when we draw. So this drawing was for a video that was about proportion, and it was looking at my technique of drawing complex architectural scenes, particularly where I focus on a particular part of a complex scene that I think I can most easily draw with the right proportion. And I was looking at this section here, which is a repeated section on the front of the Palais Garnier in Paris, and just looking at how, starting with the side and looking at the gap, doing these two columns as a unit, then working out the proportions of this space, and then that giving me this column's position. Now I can add this column and a similar space here to here. I can create all of this, and then I know that that's the space that I need repeated, and I can start to move along. Whereas if I were to try and box out the whole length of the facade and then divide it up into however many of these repeat pieces we have, I would be extraordinarily skillful to get it correct enough that I can put all this detail into the space, into each space, and have it in the right proportions. I used this technique here as well for this spire from St. Paul's Cathedral in London, starting with this column here and drawing this section here, and then using that as a sense of proportion, and then using the proportions of this to move this way and this way, aligning these sections against that and moving out, and then having established this section, using that, the proportions of that, to help me determine my proportions of what was going up and what was coming down. I did something similar in this Berlin church. I started with these columns and moved out and established this section, and then added the triangular pediment fairly easily. And then I used the proportions of this to help me get the proportions of this rather tall drum for the dome and the smaller drum that sits on top. And of course, in all of these, we can see the other elements. We can see the creating the effect of depth. We can see the use of hatching. We can see the way more detail is shown closer than further away, and so forth. And then here is a somewhat more complex subject where, again, I drew this section first. I actually drew this, got these perspective angles correct, got this window in place, then added these sections. And once I had this section in place, I now had the width for going up. I had the width of the windows going up. I'd started the perspective pattern, and I knew that I had to tilt these lines just slightly higher as they went up. And I then could align this building off this one once I had done it. Another important drawing technique that I demonstrated in quite a lot of drawings is drawing the effect of detail, not the detail. Many artists get tangled up in subjects where there ends up being an impossibly overwhelming amount of detail to draw, or a lot of detail where a lot of precision is needed to draw it accurately. So instead of trying to draw it accurately, we look at the object overall and we think, what is the effect of that? How can we draw the effect of that? Now, this tree is a good illustration of that, where I'm not trying to draw individual leaves, I'm trying to draw the effect that all the leaves have together. And I also wanted to make my marks in a way that the leaves on the tree were different from these leaves of a plant growing up around the base of the tree. So it's also not falling into the mistake of just having a leaf pattern really that we use, but it's seeing not just trees and leaves as having a certain effect, but looking for the visual effect of different trees and different leaves, their shape, their outline, the way they hang, how many of them there are, and creating marks that capture that effect of those particular leaves. Something similar in this portion of a fence out in the country, creating the effect of the grass that's coming up all around it, but also creating the effect of the weathering and the pattern the weathering makes on the surface, and how that weathering affects the outline, the silhouette. Again, being careful not to do straight, long, unbroken lines that won't really represent well what we're looking at. Very different subject, but applying the same principles as this view of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, where if you look at the video and look at the reference photo, and you'll see the patterns that the ironwork of the bridge makes from this viewpoint is incredibly complex and would be extremely difficult to do accurately and to have look precise. So instead, I've gone for creating the feel, the effect, a visual approximation of how that detail looks all at once. I did the same thing, obviously, with the leaves as well. I did the same thing with the brickwork on this pylon, trying to create marks that give the effect without having to draw all of that precise detail. And then in August, I drew a number of subjects that were very simple, were very plain. to show that simple isn't necessarily easy. And when we have very few lines and very simple shapes, there's really nowhere to go to disguise any inaccuracies. So this drum was one such example. Another example was this blanket chest, a simple box, but where the visible construction lines with this carved decorative panel made the proportions extremely important to get right if this shape was going to end up being correct. And perhaps the one that I enjoyed the most was this, for an architectural subject, very simple line outline. Always a favourite since Sydney is my home city. But again, it demonstrated how we really have to work hard. When we're drawing freehand, we sometimes need to go really slowly and observe really carefully if we want to get the various elements of objects such as these sails in the correct proportion. Not an easy subject at all. And of course, there were many examples of perspective in the month. Now, this one may not look like an obvious one because it's not even a building, but the foreshortening of this side of the ferry was probably the most challenging part of this scene. The other challenging part of this was the waterline section, both because it wasn't as clear in the reference, but also we have a transition between the boat, the darkness, and the water. Then we did have some architectural scenes to practice perspective with. We had this scene with this very tight foreshortening. We had something similar on a much smaller scale, a facade of a church, where I forgot to put these two decorative features on the other side. We had another architectural scene, the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And then our final perspective example was this grumpy little fella from a fountain where the water came out under his chin, where we have a noticeable amount of foreshortening because we're looking down on him somewhat. Perspective is not just for buildings. It creates distortion whenever we're not looking at something straight on. Here are my three most annoying drawings. We have the lamp, where I managed to not center the lampshade on the lamp base. We have the statue, where I really got the proportions of the statue and the base incorrect. And I don't feel that I got this part of the statue itself quite long enough. And we have this one, where I made the lamp too large, despite trying to particularly not make the lamp too large. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers, and look, we'll just finish up with the final batch of August's drawings that didn't make it into any particular group, but there's no judgment on what I think of them or the worthwhile of the videos that they're in because of that. Look, if any of these take your fancy, I hope you go back and have a look at some of the videos in August that you might have missed. But look, whatever you're looking at, whatever you're drawing, however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. And I'll see you next time. Bye.